founders of CFW, it's really an honor to participate in this conversation. And I'm going to go over a couple of logistics right now. This is new, these virtual meetings. So CFW staff will be monitoring the chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And for any questions you may have, please write them into the chat, into that chat column. Submit it throughout the conversation, and we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of our conversation. Also, this being social media, please share your participation on social media. The hashtag is #CFW Fireside Chat.
Hi, Sunny, I got to break in, of course, in the spirit of technical difficulties. We're having trouble. The sound isn't making it over to YouTube, so do you mind just waiting a moment? We're going to get that going. I don't want you to get too far along and then no one hearing you. So just give us a minute.
Great, I'm checking on it now. Thank you.
Anybody know any jokes?
I have a Alexa here. I could ask her for one. I don't know. She
Marla?
It's beautiful, gorgeous, and sunny. That's at my window here.
I have these microbursts, like really, it would get very dark. And have you had them as well? Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully it stays sunny for the rest of the day.
Okay, I think you are now being heard. Thank you so much. Sunny, do you mind just rewinding back about a minute? You were doing so great. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's when it's my pleasure to introduce Felicia, and is that where I need to wind back to?
Yeah, well, if you could still go over the housekeeping, I don't think anyone heard that part. That would be really helpful.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go over some of the logistics for this virtual meeting. CFW staff will be monitoring it, and they promise not to edit us in any way. But you need to take a look at the bottom of your screen where there's a chat function. And if you have any questions throughout the conversation that you will be hearing in a few minutes, please submit your questions. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the conversation so that we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Also, please share your participation on social media. It's #CFW Fireside Chat. And let people know what you're doing and your support for CFW. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Felicia Davis and Encase Sujata, both remarkable leaders. Felicia and Sujata, if you'll introduce yourselves and then tell us how you first got involved in working for gender equity, and if you'd like, what surprised you as you took on this work?
Hi, everyone. My name is Felicia Davis. I'm the current president and CEO of Chicago Foundation for Women. I have had the honor to actually work with both of these women in different capacities. Sunny was gracious with her time in the transition, and it was because of Sujata, quite frankly, that I got involved at CFW a few years ago. The question around why I'm involved in gender equity, if anyone who knows me, I'm a girl from the south side of Chicago, and I was raised by a very, very strong mother who pushed against a lot of assumptions of the day. My mom was the first person when I was a little girl, before there was the phrase intersectionality was coined. My mother so expertly taught me about my race and gender and how that would impact me for the rest of my life, quite frankly, my professional and possibly personal life. And so I think those early conversations with my mom kind of like set me on this path. And the thing that I am the most surprised about as we do this work is when we talk about gender equity, I think a lot of men assume that we're trying to take something away from them. And they also work in environments where they see these inequities playing out in their own work environments. And yet I am surprised that they don't make the link and the connection that they themselves are also being harmed by those same inequities, that their wives, their daughters, their loved ones are also being impacted in their places of work the same way that they see those inequities play out in their workplace. And so that's one of the things that surprises me, that men aren't always making that connection about how it actually is, they are actually being harmed by those inequities.
Thanks, Felicia. And it's actually even more to the credit of the men who do get it and who have been supporters of CFW in the past. So it's a really good point. And Sujata?
Very well said, Felicia. I think you hit it right on the head, although that's not a good phrase to use at the moment, I suppose, or any moment. My name is Sujata. As Sunny mentioned and Felicia mentioned, I'm the past president and CEO of Chicago Foundation for Women. And this question about gender equity is an interesting one for me, because I cannot think of any one time that really changed my outlook. As a child growing up, my father only had 2 daughters growing up in India, and he believed that his daughters, he didn't know how to raise them other than as children, I suppose, not as sons or daughters. So we had to earn a living. So when he put us out in the world, he said that you need to do something that'll put food on the table. So that sort of was the first formative experience. And then, of course, later on in life, when I was confronted by a foreman in a factory that I worked at, who really tried to bully me. And at that point, I didn't understand if it was because I was a woman or if it was because I was a woman of color. So it really was an interesting experience. And then I went on for many years to volunteer at an organization called Apnaghar, which has been a long-time grantee of the foundation, working on issues of domestic violence, and now expanded to consider gender-based violence. And that really was, for the first time in a way that I saw women being abused and violated in really very, very personal ways. And even at that time, I think my husband was a greater feminist than I was. Of course, things have changed over the years and language has changed. We are now starting to see equity and I started to understand and learned about intersectionality and the importance of all the interconnectedness thanks to CFW.
Okay, thank you, Sujata. Someday I'm going to really have a great time reading both of your biographies because you've been such extraordinary leaders. I want to talk a little bit before we dive into some other questions just about the 35th anniversary. It's this year, and I know we would be celebrating in public a whole lot more if we didn't have the conditions that we have right now. I hope that by the fall we will be able to look at all of your faces. But first I want to thank the hundreds of women, and I'm sure a lot of them are in our audience today, who were involved in strengthening the foundation from the very beginning. Those were really heady times because at the time, there were only, I think, 7 women's foundations in the country when we started CFW. I was working for the Sophia Fund, which was a small private foundation run by or founded by Lucia Woods Lindley. And my job was to organize. So we were looking for visionary and hardworking and dedicated women to come along with us, and we were very lucky to have found so many. And of course, in the past 3.5 decades, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been involved in making it the strong organization that it is right now. In the beginning, our language wasn't as sophisticated. We knew we wanted to make sure that every woman had the opportunity to reach her full potential, and that's the kind of language that we used. We knew we wanted to focus on women who are most marginalized, and that certainly hasn't changed. And the sophistication of today's language investing in women and girls as catalysts, building strong communities for all, I think says a whole lot about what CFW is and what we trying to do. Back in 1983, when we actually did start, officially we started in 1985, but back in 83 especially, people were much less aware of the issues that women faced. And organizations that had universal missions would say to us, hey, we're working with women. Most of our clients are women. But the need was to have a specific perspective on what women needed. And we needed to listen to the women carefully to hear what they needed and to have them involved in getting what they needed. For example, there were so many job training programs that didn't include childcare. Many women were being blamed for the abuse or the assaults that they were suffering without a deep understanding of what really was going on and what was really happening to them and for them. And we knew that it was women's organizations that did know these kinds of issues deeply, and they raised that awareness. We also knew that women's groups were getting way too little money from traditional philanthropy, less than 2% in a study that Chicago Women in Philanthropy had sponsored. And so we wanted to encourage, especially women who could give, to give. One wonderful story is a friend of mine gave me a $50 check for the foundation at one of our parlor meetings. And she said, this is the first time I'm contributing to any organization without asking my husband first. So we knew we were making some headway. And the foundation has evolved in so many ways. Its inclusiveness, as both Felicia and Sujata had said, the concern with equity, the ongoing work, it's grown and it's deepened. There's a better understanding and a practice of that takes intersectionality into consideration. Gender equity is entwined with race and economics and sexual orientation and health and disability and immigrant status and much more. And we learn every day. And then, of course, the foundation has grown exponentially in the last 35 years. When people asked us, Iris and me and Lucia and Marge, if we're surprised at its success, we say, oh, no, that's exactly what we expected. Of course, we wouldn't have worked so hard if we didn't think it was going to be this successful. Because what's our current grant-making budget, Felicia?
I muted myself. I apologize. Last year, we gave $2.8 million.
Wonderful. And our first grant budget in 1985 was $50,000. So how we've grown. And it's what we've worked so hard for. And we are so proud of the work and the work that, Sujata, that you did so brilliantly for 8 years, and Felicia, that you're doing now. So in that way, Sujata, could you speak about your experience as being president and CEO for 8 years? What did you see the evolution for the foundation being?
So let me put it in context of the environment, right? This was a tumultuous time for our country, for the environment. We saw all kinds of activism really come to the fore, from Black Lives Matter to the youth activism to the Women's March. The Women's March brought about in part due to a presidential election. So this was the context in which CFW was working at the time. And so we had to think about our own work in somewhat of a different way. And
I'm sorry.
We changed internally in a number of things. Initially, we did a merger with the Eleanor Foundation, which brought greater attention to the issue of women and work, women and jobs, women and skills. And that grew to be a big portion of the work of CFW that then continued to really focus on neighborhoods through the Englewood Women's Initiative. we took a particularly close look at our invested assets and started to align the assets in line with the mission of the foundation. We also then started to look at our other internal practices, right? Starting to look at our hiring practices, starting to look at our vendor practices, and really started to align those internal practices that were consistent with the mission of the organization. And then when you look at our work externally, we began to really start thinking about what did we want the Chicago area to look like for women and girls. So we started out on the path to the 100% project, looking at the status of women and girls and really starting to understand what gender equity meant to CFW, beginning to put some language around gender equity, the intersection of race, sexuality, socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth. And then started to look really closely at leadership development and what did we want our future leaders to look like, and where could CFW play a role? And thanks to a generous gift, a bequest from Reverend Willie Barrow, we were able to do a really important leadership program. So that was sort of the evolution during those years.
And I will pick up from there, Sujata, because that's actually where I enter in my time with CFW. Sujata was the person who approached me and asked me to be an inaugural advisory board member for the Willie's Warriors Leadership Project. This is a program intentionally designed to center Black women and their leadership experiences, and to support them in that, and to also further the legacy of Reverend Willie Barrow, who felt very strongly that women in the civil rights struggle kind of received the short shrift. And she wanted women and their leadership, Black women and their leadership, to be recognized. And this is matched with Cultivate, which is the leadership program for women of color that CFW does in partnership with the Trust, the Woods Fund, and Crossroads, around women who are already in the sector, in the nonprofit sector, women of color who are leading those organizations and supporting those leaders. And so, it's been a year. It's been just about a year since I joined. Sujata also asked me to be a part of some other work around community outreach and engagement, and thinking deeply about how we as a foundation can really build upon and demonstrate our own cultural humility. So this is an organization that's been growing all along, as you can see by this thread of stories from Sunny and the beginning days to Sujata's leadership and to now, that this organization has been growing over time. So it's been a year for me, and I will say that if I look back over this year, a lot has changed. Obviously, I didn't have a crystal ball. I could not predict what has happened with COVID. I also, when I came into the organization, we had a new mayor. There's a lot of excitement, but there was also a lot of tragedy across the city. At that time, I think my initial sit down with the Chicago Tribune was, I want women to be safe in every part of the city of Chicago. CFW does great work around domestic violence, but there was this Black women were being murdered and were missing on the south and west sides of Chicago, and trans women were being murdered on the north sides of Chicago. So there was that context. And then over that year, so working with community organizers and others, and so kind of like not the usual suspects, CFW issued a special grant opportunity focusing on those populations and really seeking the community partners who were closer, who are boots on the ground, and being very intentional about that. And so really proud about that. And there'll be more announcements about that soon. So going into, summer, the 34th anniversary luncheon, my first luncheon as CEO, and we were flipping the script. And so I think if you look at 2019, I think a lot of what we were doing was pushing against the notion of what is a philanthropist. I'm a member of a giving circle, the Southside Giving Circle, but I love all of our CFW hosts 6 giving councils and circles. This is a way that pushes against the narrative about who is a philanthropist. It's not just the short kind of like fat guy on the cover of the Monopoly game. It is us. It's every woman, every person represented on this call today. And so through that work, working with the Women's Philanthropy Institute and the Southside Giving Circle, there was this story around all the single ladies and the learning that came out of a study around who gives and why, and communities and that women, single women, were really more likely to give their time, money, and talent. And so that's going into the fall. We get into the fall, and this is just happenstance. At our luncheon last year, Elaine Walteroth said, this is about leadership, and this is why leadership matters. Elaine said that all of the positions that she had at Condé Nast, being the youngest editor-in-chief, and that storied history for the organization and a lot of the other roles, and that people did not expect a leader to look like her. Her direct quote, and she talked a lot about that in her book, More Than Enough. So we continued that into the summer, and then in the fall, in early November, CFW, now obviously we still didn't know, we started to pivot to more virtual meetings. For the first time, we began hosting our board meetings with video conference and our staff meetings with video conference. We were fortunate. We already had remote work policies. And so we started to integrate that more, and we could have not known how important that pivot was going to be as we find ourselves in complete 100% remote work presently. So that technology pivot. And then earlier this year, we did a lot of work around expanding our reach and thinking and really leaning into the cultural humility of the organization, board diversity. So expanding what our representation looks like so that everyone can see themselves represented on our board. We do that as a rule in our guidelines for grant making, and we wanted to make sure that we went beyond the normal, what your career is, and collect demographic information so we know where we are geographically, so that we know where we are from an organizational standpoint, and also where we are on the binary, non-binary measures as well. And then the beginning of this year, really doubling down on that with the board diversity work, and then also a report around engaging communities of color, the Time, Treasure, and Talent report. CFW partnered with Become, and the evaluation was made possible with support from the Kellogg Foundation. So that's really important. And this is really important about the decisions around grant making. I grew up, my mom, we weren't philanthropists, but my mother taught me very early on this responsibility to and for others, this collective well-being. We practice, cooperative economics and those types of things. And so to see CFW as an organization embrace those things and incorporate those in the decision making, making our grant making more, democratizing it more, putting it in the hands of community members to help us find and support organizations that are really, really deserving. So it's been, and then here we are. It's full circle for me, I guess, in a sense, being that it is nearly 1 year that I've been with the organization.
Yeah, you've been busy. It sounds like that's really an incredible report. And Sujata, one of the things that Felicia just said about everybody being a philanthropist, of being able to give time or treasure, talent. Can you talk a little bit about how women and girls can do that today? How can everybody have an impact on advancing gender equity, making it attainable, maybe in our lifetimes, although I'm not sure, but given my age, but what do you think would really make a difference? What kind of practices, what kind of policies? And how can women and girls be involved today?
So that is a big question. That is a complicated question.
I've got about 4 minutes to give the answer to.
And I don't know that I have one answer. And I think it's going to take many different approaches in many different ways. Certainly, women are at the front lines of this pandemic, and let's give them the not just the accolades they deserve, but I think they deserve, a fair wage. They deserve a fair workplace. They deserve a fair working conditions. And I think for me, it starts there. It's about sort of the dignity of work. And if these are people who are taking care of our sick, our most loved ones, our children, our parents, our grandparents, then we should be thinking about them. So when you think about who's taking care of your children or your grandchildren or your grandparents, I'd like you to sort of think about, the expense as not being an expense, but really how much would you pay? And I've been hearing a lot from parents who are really understanding the value of teachers today in this pandemic, and how much they're willing to pay teachers. So hopefully that will change in reality, and it's not just a joke of the moment, as it were. I think we have elections this year. So women and young women in particular have a really important responsibility to participate in these elections in many different ways. Whether from being willing to vote, from going to the voting booth, all the way to participating in the elections in a number of ways, supporting a candidate, going out and canvassing on behalf of a candidate, understanding the issues that affect women and girls. We have another opportunity with the census and really advocate on behalf of the needs in our community and really making sure that we get counted and get counted fully. And I think we'll have made a great step to progress if we ever get to the point where we can say, when nobody says this about women, that they don't support each other, that women don't support each other, that they're the ones who hurt each other the most. I think there was a quote in the CFW office from Madeleine Albright, right? That there's a special place in hell. So let's remember that. And I think that at the very basic level, I think we can start there.
Right. I think the whole quote was, "There's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women." Right. I remember when she said that. Felicia, in this time, and Sujata suggested a lot of things that are coming to the forefront, and it's perhaps a cliche already that what COVID-19 has done is lifted all of the issues that have already we know are affecting our population, particularly those who are poor and who are Black and Latino and LGBTQ immigrants. We know this. We know that domestic violence is rising in these times. We know that housing, one of my really heart issues, is going to be such a question about how people are going to be housed when they haven't had an income for who knows how long, and what are landlords going to do? Could you tell us how CFW is some more about how they're shifting gears during this current pandemic, and how is CFW leading the fight against these really hard things that are happening, particularly to women and to girls?
Thanks, Sunny. You are correct. COVID has just really unearthed and brought to light all of the inequities that were already in place. And so as I think about it, as you all think about it, every system that we have depended on is crashing under the weight of its own inequities. Our economic system really runs on unpaid work given, a majority of which is given by women. That this economy could not work and function without this unpaid work historically that has been carried out by women. And so for the first time, and you all know this, having talked about paid leave, paid sick leave, paid caregiving, paying women or caregivers their worth for many, many years, for the very, very first time ever, and I guess if this is a bright spot, then this would be it, that the concept of paid time for all is accepted and is talked about in Congress and also in boardrooms, that it is no longer the woman's shoulder only, her burden to shoulder alone, that employers are talking about, and everyone understands, policymakers, government officials. For the first time, it was a year ago, there were systems fighting against an equitable wage, a $15 wage. And today, those very workers who were being denied a living wage are carrying us by providing so many vital services on the front line. So for our part at CFW, part of what we've done in these early days is really think about, we've centered our grantee organizations, and really those who have limited resources and capacity. As the money was being, the CARES Act was passed, and access to PPP, payroll protection, and other monies, it was clear that the smaller organizations were being left out, that the nonprofit sector as a whole was an afterthought, that the SBA really, if you went through an application, it was really geared towards business and so a corporation or a business, the questions that were asked. So CFW partnered with, through a grant from MacArthur, we partnered with FMA, Financial Management Associates, and started to provide capacity and support to smaller organizations, holding sessions to help walk people through this process. And also we reached out to banks, because the other thing that's happened is that everyday residents in Chicago, as they were receiving, and a lot of the unbanked communities were receiving their stimulus dollars, they go to these predatory type banking entities that charge them exorbitant fees. So we reached out to banks that we have a relationship with and asked them if they would be willing to cash those checks without fees. We reached out to banks and asked them if they would be willing to accept and process the applications of nonprofit organizations who were either themselves fiscally sponsored, so they didn't have a primary banking relationship, so that they also could have access and not be blocked out by all of these extra kind of hurdles that you had to go through. And as you think about it, I mean, as we think about it, and as you think about it, the impact of COVID will have a long tail. And so we are thinking about how can we, one, respond, so what our response has been and what it will be in the near future, two, help recover. Illinois and Chicago residents were already challenged. The human service sector was already challenged because of a budget impasse. There was just some relief and recovery, and the sector was starting to lift. There had been services cut, staffing cut prior to this that were just starting to be restored. And now with the initial wave and the continued wave of the financial impact, more services are under threat. Organizations, by the end of this fiscal year, so many organizations will have financial difficulty that they may not be able to overcome. So CFW will lean into work that it has done, we have done in the past, with helping with mergers, with helping with capacity building. This is where we're strong. We will be helping to recover some of those services that are currently under threat, and perhaps get organizations that are like-minded to come together and to form an alliance or allegiance together. And we will also be working to make the sector more resilient. And so the word for us moving into the future really is around resilience and building resilience into the sector. And not only that, we will be working with every organization that we touch to build a more intentional gender lens in their organizations. I know that many of the people here, I know that you all know this, that often we're one of the few organizations that will ask, what's the gender lens to this? And so many decisions are being made irrespective of who is being impacted. And it's really important that we ask those questions. And so as we work with organizations in the future, as we're building more resilience, we will start to look and peel back the onion on their own practices and policies. Are they giving paid time off? What are their internal practices and policies? Because our goal is that if we can make the sector, I mean, this sector is broad and serves a lot of constituents, not just the people who walk in the door for the services, but those men and women who are every day rolling up their sleeves to help in our communities, and we want to help them too. And so moving forward, we'll be building and working with the grantee organizations to do more of that and building resilience into the sector, so that no matter what comes next, if it's another COVID, if it's whatever, if it's a bad election, I don't know, whatever comes next, we will have the opportunity to be able to support.
So you're calling it the RRR fund, right? Response, Recovery, and Resilience.
Yes.
That's great. And we'll talk a little bit later about how people might be able to contribute to that. Thank you so much. one of the things I always loved about CFW is that we did have access to and encourage people to tell us what's going on. Please let us know what's happening. How can we help? Rather than assuming that we knew. And to say, okay, here's a program. So, and you're carrying on that legacy forever. That's wonderful. Talking about resilience, Sujata, what do you think, what are your thoughts on what it means to be resilient in this time? What do, especially, I mean, you could tell us personally, of course, but what about the nonprofits, the organizations, foundations? What do they need in order to be resilient in the wake of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, and this goes back to the RRR, right? You know, initially organizations, foundations had to respond. Now I feel we're in the recovery phase, but ultimately I think only those who are resilient will continue to thrive and grow. And I think those who take this opportunity, this recovery phase, to really think about the opportunities that are out there, those are the ones that will ultimately thrive. And I think this is a time to really think about the use of technology. You know, it's not enough to just consider moving your programs online just as they are, just converting directly. I think this is an opportunity to really think differently about your programming. You'll be able to bring it to a much wider audience. This is a time for bold ideas. Somebody said the other day that, you know, this is a time when you can really take risks and get away with it. This is a time that you will be allowed to take a bold risk, to step out there, and your donors and funders will let you take that risk, because these are really extraordinary times. Will nonprofits be willing to let go of their legacy programs that no longer work? This is a question that I think is at the heart of resilience, that you can't continue to do what you were doing before. This is an opportunity to try something different. Will, you know, Felicia mentioned collaborations and mergers. Will nonprofits continue to work more collaboratively, to think that they don't have to take everything on, that they do what they're best at and work with others who do things that they're best at? So collaboratively, you can help, you can provide services in the community. When it comes to foundations, you know, I've been working with a couple of different foundations over the past year or so, and learning a lot from them when it comes to their influence and what they can do. One, I want to talk about a couple of them. One, without naming names, which is in the scheme of things, not an immensely large foundation, but a global foundation that where the leader happens to be a woman. I think it is because she's a woman, has been able to really use her influence so far beyond the scope of the work or the size of the foundation, that to really be able to step forward and use her influence for really changing a whole system, when it comes to divestment from fossil fuels, for instance. She's been able to motivate university endowments. She's been able to motivate bigger foundations. She's been able to motivate cities. So I think, and now really at the forefront of trying to change laws to make sure that foundations can give more, to step beyond the 5% or the 6% of the endowment. And I think that's a critical leadership role that foundations can play. Foundations, I'm working with another foundation that has really sort of been thinking very, very deeply about what being in community and what being part of community, and how to think about their own power, and really putting themselves out there when they think about how they share power. Felicia mentioned humility, so really starting to think about kind of what that means, and in the context of the pandemic, have the ability, because they have the resources, to actually hire a futurist to work with the staff to think about what the future might be. So I think, foundations can do so many different interesting things. Again, a time to be bold, a time to be proactive.
Thank you so much, Sujata. That's a really interesting challenge. Well put. Maybe it is time for us to answer some questions from our audience. And Felicia, I hope somebody asks you about what you've learned from this effort on COVID-19 and how it's going to inform the future. But let us turn it over to Emily Drika. Emily, are you on?
I sure am. Can you hear me?
Before you give the first question, Sujata, I wanted to build on something she just said and just expand upon what foundations can do. And some of that is to be countercyclical, right? Is to increase grant making, not to divest. A number of organizations nationally have divested in some really important programs for girls and for others. And it's important that we really double down on those investments and hold firm and hold space for everyone, for us, for women and girls who are being impacted. The other thing that foundations can do is to think about funding nonprofits more equitably. I do think it's a disservice that many of the people who are on the front lines themselves, and this is when this goes to overhead and administrative costs, that they should be able, as a basic right, provide their employees health insurance. That as you're doing life-saving work and helping others, that you yourself should also have those benefits. So I think that foundations can think about how they are allocating those costs and providing additional general operating support for nonprofits and organizations. And the other thing is not just to think about the grant dollars that go out, if that's the front door into organizations, think about the money you're spending on your administrative operations, your overhead. Who are you hiring? Who's your graphic designer? Who is your printer? Who is your caterer? Where are you going for those types of services? Who provides IT support? On our annual report last year, we published for the first time the names of the women and minority organizations that help us do the great work that we do. Foundations can lead the way by signaling how important it is to support with the dollars that you're already spending as a matter of business, spending those dollars intentionally with small organizations for us, centering women and organizations that are led by women and companies and vendors, as well as minority businesses. So I think there was a couple more things that foundations and philanthropy can do. And then I'll shut up so Emily can ask the questions.
Thanks, Felicia. No worries.
Like an op-ed piece, both of you. That'd be great.
I was taking notes.
Okay. So Emily.
Yeah, can you hear me?
On now?
Yep. Okay. So we have a couple questions from our fabulous audience. Kata Bauer wants to know, and this is also Gina Spitz had a similar question about the allocation of resources in this time where resources are so scarce. And so kind of thinking about prioritization. Also, Kata mentioned duplication of work and mission, there's a large nonprofit sector and some might be duplicating one another. I know both you and Sujata mentioned mergers. So this is for both of you. Could you speak a little bit more about both what CFW is doing as well as what you think we should be doing in the future to facilitate a collaboration between organizations?
I'll start. Sujata mentioned this too about a collaboration and how important that is. And also this is the opportunity to to be bold and to take risks. If I would say that collaboration is a risk, which for the sector, I think sometimes it is viewed as a risk, but more and more we have to think about the impact that we are intending and who are all the partners. I have a friend who says, think about the not the usual suspects. Who can we all bring to the table? I mean, as many of you may know, I served for a long time in government. And so absolutely government at every level, city, county, and state and federal, are funding many of the same areas and issues that many of the foundations in Chicago and the region are funding. They also have data that they have collected. So working with policymakers, our government officials understanding they're there to being transparent about our own, helping to make decisions or using that data to drive our decision making, and not being wedged to, we've always done it this way. I mean, it is time to pivot. And I think this is a good pivot. This is a good opportunity to pivot and to really think more intentionally and spread out our partnerships and bring people. So spread out the partnerships, but then bring people in and start to do this work together and collectively.
Great. Sujata, you have to unmute yourself to answer that question too.
Felicia, I think, has laid it out. So let me just say something else. There is a duplication of effort. And I have sort of a divided view on this. Personally, I do believe in collaboration and merger. I don't believe that one entity can solve the problems that we're facing, the very complex problems that we're facing. Having said that, I also think that there needs to be sort of a range of sizes of organizations that work together. So having said that, collaboration needs to be tight, and there are many, many levels of collaboration. Merger is one extreme, but there are many steps in between, whether you think about joint ventures, whether you think about coming together to do some advocacy, whether you're part of a coalition. There are many, many ways of thinking about what coming together and having a collaboration means. During this time, one of the things that makes me nervous is some really important key organizations are going to go away. And so what's going to happen is that it's not just necessarily about duplication of effort. Somebody on the north side is not going to go all the way to the west side for services, even though services are duplicated. Just as somebody on the south side is not going to go to the west side of the city. So we have to be careful when we say duplication of effort and what that means. And we have to think about what it means when you create so many mergers and acquisitions that you end up with one gigantic, almost a monopoly, right? So I just offer that word of caution. While I believe completely in collaboration, I think we have to be careful on the flip side of that.
Thank you. Suzanne Musicanto is checking in, and she would like to know, she said she was involved way back when the giving circles and councils were brand new.
Hi, Suzanne.
And Suzanne wants to know how they've evolved and what their impact has been like. Sujata, maybe you could start based on what you've seen, and then I know, Felicia, you have a very personal connection to this work.
So Suzanne, good. Glad you're on the call. So great question. So the giving circles have evolved, at least during my time, from being identity-based. So in addition to identity-based giving circles that were meant for women of color, for LGBTQ or LBTQ, and so on, those have evolved to be, I think, more inclusive by creating geographic circle on the north side, on the North Shore, on the south side, which Felicia was one of the original members of that group, and then one in the western suburbs. So I think that has grown. Of course, the membership has grown over time, and the ways that the geographic circles respond is a little bit different from the way that the identity-based circles go, and Felicia can bring you up to date on those.
Yeah, thanks, Sujata. And I'll add that the Giving Councils and Circles this year surpassed $1 million in giving. And so if you think about the collective impact of women coming together and investing their own resources, that is significant. It's great. And then the spring, as COVID has wreaked havoc, all of the Giving Councils and Circles hosted by CFW came together. You must understand that each of these circles and councils have their own charter. They all focus on different areas geographically, but also how they're doing their grant making. And they came together and they pulled their funds together and they made grant making decisions together as a collective. And I don't know what stronger testament there is than to see that play itself out and to see the evolution. They have come together not beyond just their grant making. They've hosted educational webinars and seminars prior to the digital space. But in the digital space, they were hosting a virtual living room where people could come together virtually, virtual dance parties, and those other types of engagement to really deepen the relationships and to expand the reach. And so I know we'll have like, what can you do? Anyone who is out there, if you're interested in joining a giving council or circle, you can send us a note at the foundation. We would love, as Sujata said, we have the western suburbs, the South Side Giving Circle in the south suburbs. We have issue-based Young Women, Women United, and LGBTQ, as well as North Shore. And you have the opportunity to help spotlight organizations in your own community who don't typically get the call from larger foundations to bring them to the forefront for granting. And we are honored to support many of the organizations that we support through the Giving Councils and Circles. CFW is their first institutional grant. And that is significant. And I think it's a testament to the power of the women who come together. I know somebody said this, right? Never underestimate a group of determined people who can make change, because that's the only thing that ever has. I'm paraphrasing this quote horribly, but when people come together intentionally, really great things happen. And I think the Giving Councils and Circles are a part of it.
What's so interesting about the Giving Circles is from the beginning, foundations, philanthropy is not a democratic institution. We know that. And yet, from the beginning, we've always wanted to make philanthropy and our foundation a lot more democratic. And it sounds like the Giving Circles have been the way that that we're getting there. It's at least more democratic than most foundations. So we only have about another couple of minutes. I wondered if either of you had questions for each other.
Sujata, what do you miss the most, I guess?
What do I miss most about CFW? I think I miss my colleagues. I think I miss my colleagues. That's really all I miss at this point.
It sounds like you made the right decision, Sujata, because I know you still see your colleagues every once in a while.
And the friends I've made over the years who are donors to the foundation, and of course the founders who I still keep in touch with. So, yeah.
So Felicia, what about being in philanthropy, since you've come from a variety of different backgrounds? What about being in philanthropy was surprising to you?
Well, it's not sexy. People will probably laugh. And so we stopped counting, but from the time I started in late May until November 13th or something, I had, like over 300 external meetings with people. And I will say the thing that surprised me the most, this is the truth, it's not glamorous, is the amount of food I've had to eat in a year. Like, and this was, before COVID, so now maybe I'll lose some weight, because before it was, you're meeting with people, you're talking about the mission, we're raising money, and it's like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I was happy to do it, but I was not prepared for that level of enjoyment.
Yeah, we're good eaters in philanthropy. Well, thank you both. This has been such a pleasure being in your virtual presence, and I hope that soon it'll be actual presence. And I just have a few closing remarks. First, to everybody who is on this call, thank you so much. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your interest in Chicago Foundation for Women. And especially thank you to those who already contributed to the CFW's Response, Recovery, and Resilience Fund. For those of you who haven't, please consider supporting the fund. As Felicia mentioned, it's it's providing money, much necessary money, to continue this, to support women and girls in our region. It's not only now, but what's going to happen in the future. And we have to think about that a lot, about what's going to happen once this virus is under some control. I think there's ways of doing that. I think back on one of the things that I learned. I mean, I never even sold Girl Scout cookies, and then I was in the position of trying to raise money for a new foundation that everybody kept saying, why do we need a women's fund? Doesn't everybody else do that? But we know that the hard work of CFW is critical, and it's critical in the past, and it's critical now, and it'll be especially critical in the future. So we would be very grateful for anything that you can contribute. And thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.